à-bas-le-ciel.
There are profound differences in the attitude towards work and personal responsibility that differentiate China from Canada. But despite the fact that China has one of the most despised legal systems in the world, the court system in China, basically nobody gets a fair trial. It's also fair to say that China has undertaken a series of social policies on drug addiction and drug use that are incredibly effective, that get really impressive results, even in the small towns that are right on the border between Myanmar and Yunnan, even adjacent to the Golden Triangle, even an area that has local heroin production, or heroin production is right there next door. And those policies are way more effective than any drug policy ever undertaken in the history of Colombia or any other drug policy undertaken in the history of Canada. And we should have the humility to learn from that, experience. Even if China's wrong about everything else. Guys, even a broken wristwatch is right twice a day. It's not possible for China to be wrong about everything just because they're a communist dictatorship. The drug enforcement policy in China has a real price. It's going to have a price in dollars and cents. It's going to have a price in, employing police officers and many other things. And it's going to have a price in human blood. We have to ask ourselves, for the future of Vancouver, for the future of Victoria, for the future of these places that already have such enormous numbers of drug addicts stamping around on the streets, what are we willing to do? What price are we willing to pay? And are we willing to learn from the full range of examples and case studies around the world, whether that be the streets of Amsterdam or the streets of Yunnan, China?
À-bas-le-ciel.
Hey guys, some of you who watched my video that I uploaded yesterday will have guessed that I am in fact filming these videos sitting on the floor. We just moved into our new apartment in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. Our desks arrived today, so our tables will arrive for this apartment today. Our bed arrived just a couple of days ago, but piece by piece, some things being ordered on the internet, some things being bought in person in real life. We're putting together the bare necessities. But of course, the first priority goes to the kitchen and baking equipment and what have you, on which indeed I've spent a considerable sum of money. All right, with that having been said, this video is a response to a comment from Mod Vegan on my Patreon. And actually, I think I'm going to make 2 videos today responding to 2 different comments from Mod Vegan. So I think she gets a lot of value out of her $1 donation to my Patreon. And I get a lot of value out of her $1 donation too, because it inspires a lot of my content responding to her. She enjoyed most of the video that we uploaded yesterday that discussed quite a number of different topics, but she did not enjoy so much our endorsement in passing of Chinese anti-drug policy. So we mentioned very briefly. My girlfriend's off camera here. She can chime in anytime she wants to. Oh, you gonna poke your head in, babe?
Hi.
Anyway, we were living on the border between China and Myanmar, which is an area formerly known as the Golden Triangle. The Golden Triangle is a bit of a misnomer. I feel inaccurate. We weren't right on the Golden Triangle. It's a little bit further south. But that is an area where on the Burmese side of the border there has been long and intermittent warfare from a rebel group called the KIA, the Kachin Independence Army, and a few other rebel groups too, like the Kokang rebel group that I made a YouTube video about, their political situation. It's an area where the trade in illicit guns, illicit lumber, and illicit drugs is well known and of long standing. And as you can imagine, a long-term situation of civil war is going to be a part of that. But where we were in that part of China, the government has a very, very tough, very heavily enforced anti-drug policy and a very tough, very clear public education campaign about what the government's position on drugs is and what they expect of the public in terms of compliance, shall we say, in terms of sobriety. That's really what this comes down to. And, I should say beyond that, historically, the use of heroin there, the use of opium, really, it is a traditional part of their culture. And when European empires first got involved in the politics of the region, they used opium as their currency. For those of you who don't know, heroin is a refined form of opium, so it comes from the same plant. It's the same poppy, the same flower, but there is a difference in terms of the processing between opium and heroin. And in the old days of both the British Empire and the French Empire, trying to control that region, southern Yunnan, and then the adjacent part of Myanmar and northern Laos and northern Vietnam, balls, there was a black rubber ball of opium, and chests full of opium. That really was the currency that made those empires function. And indeed, it was the main reason why they were trying to conquer that area, trying to influence that area, and why they were even trying to build railroads through that area. This is a topic I've done formal research on, and that I have one formal publication on, like something published on paper in a book reflecting those years of my political engagement, historical research. And yet today, with all of these factors, with all of this historical background, political context, you might expect the streets of Dehong to be full of drug addicts, and they are not. On the contrary, it's the streets of Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, that are full of drug addicts, to our horror. A world away, Vancouver, BC, it doesn't have easy or direct access to heroin, doesn't have easy or direct access to cocaine either. Those drugs have to be illegally shipped there over a huge distance, whereas in the part of Yunnan we were living in, you can walk across the border to northern Myanmar and acquire all those things, or they could be shipped the other way, etc. Maud Vegan writes to me on Patreon expressing her alarm that we would say anything positive about a country like China, where about 2,000 people a year are executed, and many of those executions are for drug dealing offenses. That generally speaking, drug dealing, drug trafficking in China is going to carry a death penalty offense. Now, China is very far from the only country in the world that has a death penalty for drug trafficking. Another example, which is culturally linked, is Singapore. Singapore is a capitalist country, but they also have a death penalty for many different drug offenses. China's death penalty is mostly infamous. In general, the Chinese justice system is infamous mostly for persecuting political dissidents and that sort of thing, persecuting people who criticize the government. That's the main thing we hear debated in the Western press, is when, some lawyer who represented somebody in a human rights case is being persecuted, when someone who dared to publish articles criticizing the government is being tortured or interred or persecuted. And I have made videos on this channel about that in the past. The main video I did about it, I should do more on Chinese politics, coming up on this channel, as I now have access to a library in Canada, and I'm living in Canada. I'm not living in China anymore. A lot of things about my own political position have changed. I have a video on document number 9 of the new mass line movement, and that talks about political persecution and indeed the use of torture and unfair imprisonment and torture of people in China. Imprisonment, interrogation, torture, etc. in China. However, you do not hear a lot of complaints in the Western press or otherwise about the conviction and execution of drug addicts and drug dealers. Now, it may simply be that I am more conservative than Maud Vegan. It may simply be that I am more judgmental or what have you, or that I have a different perspective on, drug law enforcement and what have you. I know that a lot of her experience and a lot of her research is by contrast in South America and Latin America. So places like Colombia, Venezuela, Brazil, I would assume Bolivia also, places that have their own violent history of drug dealing, drug addiction, and rebel armies, of low-level revolution, insurrection, rebellion, etc., where the link between drugs and guns is very real, with enormous political consequences. And it would be interesting. Maybe we should have Maud Vegan come on Skype and discuss this with me. Maybe she really does have very good reasons for why she is terrified of a government imitating the policies that China has in being so harshly repressive towards drug addiction, illicit drug use. However, I've got to tell you, when I contrast the reality on the street between Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, and Dehong, which is in Yunnan province, yes, I choose the Chinese policy every time. And I do so with an awareness that there's a body count attached to it. There absolutely is. Here in Victoria, I knew one guy, he's also vegan, who worked in rehabilitating drug addicts. So I won't describe exactly what his job was, but he worked with hundreds and hundreds of different, long-term drug addicts in helping them get housing, helping them go to job interviews, I think helping them go to recovery and treatment centers, but also more kind of long-term. He was more in the long-term thing, not the short-term, not the immediate task of getting them off drugs just for their first couple of weeks quitting, but then trying to get them into a lifestyle long-term that's sustainable for them. And when I asked him, in all due seriousness, what percentage of his clients are success stories, what percentage successfully recover, and what percentage fail, his answer was 100% failure, which shocked me. And at first I thought maybe he was joking. His tone was very sad in saying this. He didn't seem like he was joking. So I asked him further. No, he was not joking. His experience after many years of working in this field was of a 0% recovery rate. That none of his clients, I don't know how many hundreds or how many thousands he has worked with by now over many years working in that field, that none of them recovered. None of them ever got back to what could be considered a normal life of even working a minimum wage job and paying their own rent, that they remained variously permanently disabled, permanently drug addicted, permanently in a perpetual cycle of relapsing onto drug use, and so on. That was his professional experience. And it's very sad and it's bleak. Downtown Vancouver, Canada, Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, we saw two different men just walking the streets on the same night. On the same night, we saw two different men with the needle in their arm visibly as we walked past them. So they were on major streets, we're in a back alley, openly for anyone to see under the street lamps, for shop owners to see, for parents walking home with their children. We saw two different men with the needle in their arm during the moment of injecting heroin into their veins. That openly. I mean, there were security cameras around and so on. And, of course, we saw many, many more drug addicts staggering around once they had already shot up heroin, once they had already gotten high. But on the same night, we saw two different men with the skin of their arm out and the needle in their arm at that moment. And this does indeed reflect, as my girlfriend said somewhat vaguely and briefly in the earlier video, an attitude of Canadian law enforcement that I cannot in good conscience call tolerance. I think it has to be called indifference. That there is an indifference to these people destroying their lives and, frankly, probably destroying the lives of others, having a very negative impact on a lot of other people's lives around them. A small number of drug addicts in downtown downtown Vancouver we're talking about. This would also be true of downtown Victoria. But in downtown Vancouver, how many hundred drug addicts of this kind do you think you're talking about? Are you talking about 5,000 people? Are you talking about 500 people? Real social science work can come up with an accurate estimate. These things are not impossible to know. But a small number of people are having a tremendously negative impact on the lives of millions of people around them in the city as a whole. And I think that is something to be taken seriously. So Maud Vegan raises the warning that China, this is her statistic, I haven't checked it, but she claims that China currently executes about 2,000 people a year. Now, obviously, that will not all be for drug offenses. I don't know. We could look up how many of those people are executed for drug offenses. But I pointed out in riposte, China's population is so enormous that if we look at this in proportion to the Canadian population, we might be talking about Canada executing 50 people a year. Now, again, how many executions will we be talking about being for drug addiction? Can Canada do a better job than China? Well, would it be recklessly optimistic to say yes? There are many fields of human endeavor where the Chinese now do better than Canada. Face up to it. What is Canada the best in the world in right now? Maple syrup? Maple syrup and not much else. If Canada took seriously its role in trying to eliminate drug addiction, at least this type of extreme hard drug use and drug addiction, how well could we do? Could we do half as well as China? Could we do twice as well as China? I think that really is debatable. I'm not some kind of Canadian nationalist who's blinded with optimism, or perhaps even optimism rooted in racism, that somehow if Canada undertook similar policies, we'd have better outcomes with a lower cost in blood, a lower cost in human lives. Maybe we'd kill twice as many people, proportionate to our population, and we'd have half as much of a positive effect. I don't know. I'm quite open to the possibility that Canada will never do as good a job in this area of human endeavor as China is already doing. I think Canada is never going to build a railroad half as good as the railroad that connects China to Tibet right now, which is one of the best railroads in the world, if not the best railroad in the world. I think Canada is never going to manufacture iPhones or computer equipment the way China does. There are many reasons for that. There are many different things China is better at than Canada. I'll just give you one other random one that isn't based on them having low salaries. When you go to China and talk to a university professor, in any specialized field, in my experience, specialized field like Buddhism, specialized field like history, politics, languages, indigenous, ethnic minority politics, anthropology. I've dealt with professors in many different fields. When you talk to a specialized professor within China, they are connected to and know useful things about every other professor in China, and to some extent every professor in the world working in that field. When you talk to a university professor in Canada, by contrast, it's a useless dead end. They have none of those connections. They don't have that guanxi. Guanxi is the term in Chinese. They don't have that kind of useful cooperative attitude. This is one example, but if you have a lot of experience working in Chinese society at any level, whether it's on the factory room floor or in academia, there are profound differences in the attitude towards work and personal responsibility that differentiate China from Canada. Anyway, there are many, many ways in which China actually does have advantages over Canada, culturally, educationally, etc. But despite the fact that China has one of the most despised legal systems in the world, the court system in China, basically nobody gets a fair trial. I was just saying to my girlfriend offhand as a quip, in the United States of America, some people get a fair trial. Some. In general, multimillionaires get a fair trial in America. The American justice system works very well for rich people, and it works very poorly for poor people. That's a general rule of thumb in the United States of America. But some people get a fair trial in America. Some. In China, it is fair to say nobody gets a fair trial. However, it is also fair to say that China has undertaken a series of social policies on drug addiction and drug use that are incredibly effective, that get really impressive results, even in the small towns that are right on the border between Myanmar and Yunnan. Even adjacent to the Golden Triangle, even an area that has local heroin production, or heroin production is right there next door. And those policies are way more effective than any drug policy ever undertaken in the history of Colombia, or any other drug policy undertaken in the history of Canada. And we should have the humility to learn from that experience. Even if China's wrong about everything else. Guys, even a broken wristwatch is right twice a day. It's not possible for China to be wrong about everything just because they're a communist dictatorship. It's not possible for Iran to be wrong about everything just because they're a crazy Muslim dictatorship. Semi-dictatorship. They have their own degree of democracy in Iran. They do have some democracy and some role for elections, admittedly. But, the Iranian government's wrong about a lot of things, but they can't possibly be wrong about everything. And this is a situation, and it's maybe not the only one, where we have to have the humility to set aside our biases, and whether you're looking at this as a political scientist or as a layperson, as a concerned layperson, say, yes, the drug enforcement policy in China has a real price. It's going to have a price in dollars and cents. It's going to have a price in, employing police officers and many other things. And it's going to have a price in human blood. We have to ask ourselves, for the future of Vancouver, for the future of Victoria, for the future of these places that already have such enormous numbers of drug addicts stamping around on the streets, what are we willing to do? What price are we willing to pay? And are we willing to learn from the full range of examples and case studies around the world, whether that be the streets of Amsterdam or the streets of Yunnan, China?
À-bas-le-ciel.